The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Chapter 13. The Story of Charles F. Hurd. How the Titanic Sank. Water strewn with dead bodies. Victims met death with hymn on their lips. The story of how the Titanic sank is told by Charles F. Hurd, who was a passenger on the Carpathia. He praised highly the courage of the crew, hundreds of whom gave their lives with a heroism which equaled but could not exceed that of John Jacob Astor, Henry B. Harris, Jacques Futrelle, and others in the long list of first cabin passengers. The account continues. The crash against the iceberg, which had been sighted at only a quarter-mile distance, came almost simultaneously with the click of the levers operated from the bridge, which stopped the engines and closed the watertight doors. Captain Smith was on the bridge a moment later, summoning all on board to put on life preservers and ordering the lifeboats lowered. The first boats had more male passengers, as the men were the first to reach the deck. When the rush of frightened men and women and crying children to the decks began, the "women first" rule was rigidly enforced. Officers drew revolvers, but in most cases there was no use for them. Revolver shots heard shortly before the Titanic went down caused many rumors. One, that Captain Smith had shot himself. Another, that First Officer Murdoch had ended his life. But members of the crew discredit these rumors. Captain Smith was last seen on the bridge just before the ship sank, leaping only after the decks had been washed away. What became of the men with the life preservers was a question asked by many since the disaster. Many of these with life preservers were seen to go down despite the preservers, and dead bodies floated on the surface as the boats moved away. Facts which I have established by inquiries on the Carpathia, as positively as they could be established in view of the silence of the few surviving officers, are that the Titanic's officers knew, several hours before the crash, of the possible nearness of the icebergs, that the Titanic's speed, nearly 23 knots an hour, was not slackened, that the number of lifeboats on the Titanic was insufficient to accommodate more than one-third of the passengers, to say nothing of the crew. Most members of the crew say there were 16 lifeboats and 2 collapsibles. None say there were more than 20 boats in all, and the 700 escaped filled most of the 16 lifeboats and the 1 collapsible which got away to the limit of their capacity. Had the ship struck the iceberg head-on at whatever speed and with whatever resulting shock, the bulkhead system of watertight compartments would probably have saved the vessel. As one man expressed it, it was the impossible that happened when, with a shock unbelievably mild, the ship's side was torn for a length which made the bulkhead system ineffective. After telling of the shock and the lowering of the boats, the account continues. Some of the boats, crowded too full to give rowers a chance, drifted for a time. Few had provisions or water. There was lack of covering from the icy air, and the only lights were the still undimmed arcs and incandescents of the settling ship, save for one of the first boats. There a steward, who explained to the passengers that he had been shipwrecked twice before, appeared, carrying 3 oranges and a green light. That green light, many of the survivors say, was to the shipwrecked hundreds as the pillar of fire by night. Long after the ship had disappeared, and while confusing false lights danced about the boats, the green lantern kept them together on the course which led them to the Carpathia. As the end of the Titanic became manifestly but a matter of moments, the oarsmen pulled their boats away, and the chilling waters began to echo splash after splash as passengers and sailors and life preservers leaped over and started swimming away to escape the expected suction. Only the hardiest of constitutions could endure for more than a few moments such a numbing bath. The first vigorous strokes gave way to heartbreaking cries of "Help! Help!" and stiffened forms were seen floating on the water all around us. Led by the green light, under the light of the stars, the boats drew away, and the bow, then the quarter, then the stacks, and at last the stern of the marvelous ship of a few days before passed beneath the waters. The great force of the ship's sinking was unaided by any violence of the elements, and the suction, not so great as had been feared, rocked but mildly the group of boats now a quarter-mile distant from it. Early dawn brought no ship, but not long after 5 a.m. the Carpathia, far out of her path and making 18 knots instead of her wonted 15, showed her single red and black smokestack upon the horizon. In the joy of that moment, the heaviest griefs were forgotten. Soon afterward, Captain Rostron and Chief Steward Hughes were welcoming the chilled and bedraggled arrivals over the Carpathia's side. Terrible as were the San Francisco, Slocum, and Iroquois disasters, they shrink to local events in comparison with this world catastrophe. True, there were others of greater qualifications and longer experience than I nearer the tragedy, but they, by every token of likelihood, have become part of the tragedy. The honored, must I say the lamented, Steed, the adroit Jacques Futrelle, what might they not tell, were their hands able to hold pencils? The silence of the Carpathia's engine, the piercing cold, the clamor of many voices in the companionways, caused me to dress hurriedly and awaken my wife at 5:40 a.m. on Monday. Our stewardess, meeting me outside, pointed to a wailing host in the rear dining room and said, "From the Titanic. She's at the bottom of the ocean." At the ship's side, a moment later, I saw the last of the line of boats discharge their loads, and saw women, some with cheap shawls about their heads, some with the costliest of fur cloaks, ascending the ship's side, and such joy as the first sight of our ship may have given them had disappeared from their faces, and there were tears and signs of faltering as the women who were helped up the ladders or hoisted aboard in swings. For lack of room to put them, several of the Titanic's boats, after unloading, were set adrift. At our north was a broad ice field, the length of hundreds of Carpathias. Around us on other sides were sharp and glistening peaks. One black berg, seen about 10 a.m., was said to be that which sunk the Titanic. Chapter 14. Thrilling Account by L. Beasley. Collision, only a slight jar. Passengers could not believe the vessel doomed. Narrow escape of lifeboats. Picked up by the Carpathia. Among the most connected and interesting stories related to the survivors was the one told by L. Beasley of Cambridge, England. He said, "The voyage from Queenstown had been quite uneventful. Very fine weather was experienced, and the sea was quite calm. The wind had been westerly to southwesterly the whole way, but very cold, particularly the last day. In fact, after dinner on Saturday evening, it was almost too cold to be out on deck at all." Only a slight jar. I had been in my berth for about 10 minutes when, at about 11:15 p.m., I felt a slight jar, and then soon after a second one, but not sufficiently violent to cause any anxiety to anyone, however nervous they may have been. However, the engine stopped immediately afterward, and my first thought was, she has lost a propeller. I went up on the top boat deck in a dressing gown, and found only a few persons there, who had come up similarly to inquire why we had stopped, but there was no sort of anxiety in the minds of anyone. We saw through the smoking room window a game of cards going on, and went in to inquire if they knew anything. It seems they felt more of the jar, and, looking through the window, had seen a huge iceberg go by close to the side of the boat. They thought we had just grazed it with a glancing blow, and that the engines had been stopped to see if any damage had been done. No one, of course, had any conception that the vessel had been pierced below by part of the submerged iceberg. The game went on without any thought of disaster, and I retired to my cabin to read until we went on again. I never saw any of the players or the onlookers again. Some were awakened. A little later, hearing people going upstairs, I went out again and found everyone wanting to know why the engines had stopped. No doubt many were awakened from sleep by the sudden stopping of a vibration to which they had become accustomed during the 4 days we had been on board. Naturally, with such powerful engines as the Titanic carried, the vibration was very noticeable all the time, and the sudden stopping had something the same effect as the stopping of a loud ticking grandfather's clock in a room. On going on deck again, I saw that there was an undoubted list downward from stern to bows, but, knowing nothing of what had happened, concluded some of the front compartments had filled and weighed her down. I went down again to put on warmer clothing, and as I dressed, heard an order shouted, "All passengers on deck with life belts on." We all walked slowly up, with the belts tied on over our clothing, but even then presumed this was only a wise precaution the captain was taking, and that we should return in a short time and retire to bed. There was a total absence of any panic or expressions of alarm, and I suppose this can be accounted for by the exceedingly calm night and the absence of any signs of the accident. The ship was absolutely still, and except for a gentle tilt downward, which I don't think 1 person in 10 would have noticed at that time, no signs of the approaching disaster were visible. She lay just as if she were waiting the order to go on again, when some trifling matter had been adjusted. But in a few moments we saw the covers lifted from the boats and the crews allotted to them standing by and coiling up the ropes which were to lower them by the pulley blocks into the water. We then began to realize it was more serious than had been supposed, and my first thought was to go down and get some more clothing and some money, but seeing people pouring up the stairs, decided it was better to cause no confusion to people coming up. Presently we heard the order, "All men stand back away from the boats, and all ladies retire to the next deck below, the smoking room deck or B deck." Men stood back. The men all stood away and remained in absolute silence, leaning against the end railings of the deck or pacing slowly up and down. The boats were swung out and lowered from A deck. When they were to the level of B deck, where all the women were collected, they got in quietly, with the exception of some who refused to leave their husbands. In some cases they were torn from them and pushed into the boats, but in many instances they were allowed to remain because there was no one to insist they should go. Looking over the side, one saw boats from aft already in the water, slipping quietly away into the darkness, and presently the boats near me were lowered, and with much creaking as the new ropes slipped through the pulley blocks down the 90 feet which separated them from the water. An officer in uniform came up as one boat went down and shouted, "When you are afloat, row round to the companion ladder and stand by with the other boats for orders." "Aye, aye, sir," came the reply, but I don't think any boat was able to obey the order. When they were afloat and had the oars at work, the condition of the rapidly settling boat was so much more a sight for alarm for those in the boats than those on board, that in common prudence the sailors saw they could do nothing but row from the sinking ship to save, at any rate, some lives. They no doubt anticipated that suction from such an enormous vessel would be more dangerous than usual to a crowded boat, mostly filled with women. All this time there was no trace of any disorder, no panic or rush to the boats, no scenes of women sobbing hysterically, such as one generally pictures happening at such times. Everyone seemed to realize so slowly that there was imminent danger. When it was realized that we might all be presently in the sea with nothing but our life belts to support us until we were picked up by passing steamers, it was extraordinary how calm everyone was and how completely self-controlled. One by one the boats were filled with women and children, lowered and rowed away into the night. Presently the word went round among the men, "The men are to be put in boats on the starboard side." I was on the port side, and most of the men walked across the deck to see if this was so. I remained where I was, and soon heard the call, "Any more ladies?" Looking over the side of the ship, I saw the boat, number 13, swinging level with B deck, half full of ladies. Again the call was repeated, "Any more ladies?" I saw none come on, and then one of the crew, looking up, said, "Any more ladies on your deck, sir?" "No," I replied. "Then you had better jump." I dropped in and fell in the bottom as they cried, "Lower way!" As the boat began to descend, two ladies were pushed hurriedly through the crowd on B deck and heaved over into the boat, and a baby of 10 months passed down after them. Down we went, the crew calling to those lowering each end to keep her level until we were some 10 feet from the water. And here occurred the only anxious moment we had during our whole experience from leaving the deck to reaching the Carpathia. Immediately below our boat was the exhaust of the condensers, a huge stream of water pouring all the time from the ship's side just above the water line. It was plain we ought to be quickly away from this, not to be swamped by it when we touched water. No officer aboard. We had no officer aboard, nor petty officer or member of the crew to take charge. So one of the stokers shouted, "Someone find the pin which releases the boat from the ropes and pull it up." No one knew where it was. We felt on the floor and sides, but we found nothing, and it was hard to move among so many people. We had 60 or 70 on board. Down we went and presently floated with our ropes still holding us, the exhaust washing us away from the side of the vessel, and the swell of the sea urging us back against the side again. The result of all these forces was an impetus which carried us parallel to the ship's side and directly under boat 14, which had filled rapidly with men and was coming down on us in a way that threatened to submerge our boat. "Stop lowering 14!" our crew shouted, and the crew of number 14, now only 20 feet above, shouted the same. But the distance to the top was some 70 feet, and the creaking pulleys must have deadened all sound to those above, for down she came, 15 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, and the stoker and I reached up and touched her swinging above our heads. The next drop would have brought her on our heads, but just before she dropped, another stoker sprang to the ropes with his knife. Just escaped another boat. "One," I heard him say. "Two," as his knife cut through the pulley ropes, and the next moment the exhaust stream had carried us clear, while boat 14 dropped into the water, into the space we had the moment before occupied, our gunwales almost touching. We drifted away easily as the oars were got out, and headed directly away from the ship. The crew seemed to me to be mostly stewards or cooks in white jackets, 2 to an oar, with a stoker at the tiller. There was a certain amount of shouting from one end of the boat to the other, and discussion as to which way we should go. But finally it was decided to elect the stoker, who was steering, as captain, and for all to obey his orders. He set to work at once to get into touch with the other boats, calling to them and getting as close as seemed wise, so that when the search boats came in the morning to look for us, there would be more chance for all to be rescued by keeping together. It was now about 1 a.m., a beautiful starlight night with no moon, and so not very light. The sea was calm as a pond, just a gentle heave as the boat dipped up and down in the swell. An ideal night, except for the bitter cold, for anyone who had to be out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in an open boat. And if ever there was a time when such a night was needed, surely it was now, with hundreds of people, mostly women and children, afloat hundreds of miles from land. Watched the Titanic. The captain stoker told us that he had been at sea 26 years and had never seen such a calm night on the Atlantic. As we rowed away from the Titanic, we looked back from time to time to watch her, and a more striking spectacle it was not possible for anyone to see. In the distance, it looked like an enormous length, its great bulk outlined in black against the starry sky, every porthole and saloon blazing with light. It was impossible to think that anything could be wrong with such a leviathan, were it not for that ominous tilt downward in the bows, where the water was now up to the lowest row of portholes. Presently, about 2 a.m., as near as I can remember, we observed it settling very rapidly, with the bows and the bridge completely under water, and concluded it was now only a question of minutes before it went. And so it proved. Mr. Beasley went on to tell of the spectacle of the sinking of the Titanic, the terrible experiences of the survivors in the lifeboats, and their final rescue by the Carpathia, as already related. Chapter 15. Jack Thayer's Own Story of the Wreck. 17-year-old son of Pennsylvania railroad official tells moving story of his rescue. Told mother to be brave, separated from parents, jumped when vessel sank, drifted on overturned boat picked up by Carpathia. One of the calmest of the passengers was young Jack Thayer, the 17-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. John B. Thayer. When his mother was put into the lifeboat, he kissed her and told her to be brave, saying that he and his father would be all right. He and Mr. Thayer stood on the deck as the small boat in which Mrs. Thayer was a passenger made off from the side of the Titanic over the smooth sea. The boy's own account of his experience, as told to one of the rescuers, is one of the most remarkable of all the ones that have come from the tremendous catastrophe. Father was in bed, and mother and myself were about to get into bed. There was no great shock. I was on my feet at the time, and I do not think it was enough to throw anyone down. I put on an overcoat and rushed up on A deck to the port side. I saw nothing there. I then went forward to the bow to see if I could see any signs of ice. The only ice I saw was on the well deck. I could not see very far ahead, having just come out of a brightly lighted room. I then went down to our room, and my father and mother came on deck with me to the starboard side of A deck. We could not see anything there. Father thought he saw small pieces of ice floating around, but I could not see any myself. There was no big berg. We walked around to the port side, and the ship then had a fair list to port. We stayed there looking over the side for about 5 minutes. The list seemed very slowly to be increasing. We then went down to our rooms on C deck, all of us dressing quickly, putting on all our clothes. We all put on life preservers, and over these we put on our overcoats. Then we hurried up on deck and walked around, looking out at different places until the women were all ordered to collect on the port side. Separated from parents. Father and I said goodbye to mother at the top of the stairs on A deck. She and the maid went right out on A deck on the port side, and we went to the starboard side. As at this time we had no idea the boat would sink, we walked around A deck and then went to B deck. Then we thought we would go back to see if mother had gotten off safely, and went to the port side of A deck. We met the chief steward of the main dining saloon, and he told us that mother had not yet taken a boat, and he took us to her. Father and mother went ahead, and I followed. They went down to B deck, and a crowd got in front of me, and I was not able to catch them and lost sight of them. As soon as I could get through the crowd, I tried to find them on B deck, but without success. That is the last time I saw my father. This was about 1/2 an hour before she sank. I then went to the starboard side, thinking that father and mother must have gotten off in a boat. All of this time I was with a fellow named Milton C. Long of New York, whom I had just met that evening. On the starboard side, the boats were getting away quickly. Some boats were already off in a distance. We thought of getting into one of the boats, the last boat to go on the forward part of the starboard side, but there seemed to be such a crowd around that I thought it was unwise to make any attempt to get into it. He and I stood by the davits of one of the boats that had left. I did not notice anybody that I knew except Mr. Lindley, whom I had also just met that evening. I lost sight of him in a few minutes. Long and I then stood by the rail just a little aft of the captain's bridge. Thought ship would float. The list to port had been growing greater all the time. About this time the people began jumping from the stern. I thought of jumping myself, but was afraid of being stunned on hitting the water. 3 times I made up my mind to jump out and slide down the davit ropes and try to make the boats that were lying off from the ship, but each time Long got hold of me and told me to wait a while. He then sat down, and I stood up, waiting to see what would happen. Even then, we thought she might possibly stay afloat. I got a sight on a rope between the davits and a star, and noticed that she was gradually sinking. About this time, she straightened up on an even keel and started to go down fairly fast at an angle of about 30 degrees. As she started to sink, we left the davits and went back and stood by the rail about even with the second funnel. Long and myself said goodbye to each other and jumped up on the rail. He put his legs over and held on a minute and asked me if I was coming. I told him I would be with him in a minute. He did not jump clear, but slid down the side of the ship. I never saw him again. About 5 seconds after he jumped, I jumped out, feet first. I was clear of the ship, went down, and as I came up, I was pushed away from the ship by some force. I came up facing the ship, and one of the funnels seemed to be lifted off and fell towards me about 15 yards away, with a mass of sparks and steam coming out of it. I saw the ship in a sort of red glare, and it seemed to me that she just broke in two just in front of the third funnel. This time I was sucked down, and as I came up I was pushed out again and twisted around by a large wave, coming up in the midst of a great deal of small wreckage. As I pushed my hand from my head, it touched the cork fender of an overturned lifeboat. I looked up and saw some men on the top and asked them to give me a hand. One of them, who was a stoker, helped me up. In a short time, the bottom was covered with about 25 or 30 men. When I got on this, I was facing the ship. The stern then seemed to rise in the air and stopped at about an angle of 60 degrees. It seemed to hold there for a time, and then with a hissing sound, it shot right down out of sight, with people jumping from the stern. The stern either pivoted around towards our boat, or we were sucked towards it, and as we had only one oar, we could not keep away. There did not seem to be much suction, and most of us managed to stay on the bottom of our boat. We were then right in the midst of the fairly large wreckage, with people swimming all around us. The sea was very calm, and we kept the boat pretty steady, but every now and then a wave would wash over it. Said the Lord's Prayer. The assistant wireless operator was right next to me, holding on to me and kneeling in the water. We all sang a hymn and said the Lord's Prayer and then waited for dawn to come. As often as we saw the other boats at a distance, we would yell, "Ship ahoy!" But they could not distinguish our cries from any of the others, so we all gave it up, thinking it was useless. It was very cold, and none of us were able to move around to keep warm, the water washing over her almost all the time. Toward dawn, the wind sprang up, roughening up the water and making it difficult to keep the boat balanced. The wireless man raised our hopes a great deal by telling us that the Carpathia would be up in about 3 hours. About 3:30 or 4 o'clock, some men on our boat on the bow sighted her mast lights. I could not see them, as I was sitting down with a man kneeling on my leg. He finally got up, and I stood up. We had the second officer, Mr. Lightoller, on board. We had an officer's whistle and whistled for the boats in the distance to come up and take us off. It took about an hour and a half for the boats to draw near. 2 boats came up. The first took half, and the other took the balance, including myself. We had great difficulty about this time in balancing the boat, as the men would lean too far. But we were all taken aboard the already crowded boat, and in about half or 3/4 of an hour later, we were picked up by the Carpathia. I have noticed Second Officer Lightoller's statement that J.B. Thayer was on our overturned boat, which would give the impression that it was father, when he really meant it was I, as he only learned my name in a subsequent conversation on the Carpathia, and did not know I was a junior. Chapter 16. Incidents related by James McGough. Women forced into the lifeboats. Why some men were saved before women. Asked to man lifeboats. Surrounded by his wife and members of his family, James McGough of Philadelphia, a buyer for the Gimble brothers, whose fate had been in doubt, recited a most thrilling and graphic picture of the disaster. As the Carpathia docked, Mrs. McGough, a brother, and several friends of the buyer met him, and after the touching reunion had taken place, the party proceeded to Philadelphia. Vivid in detail, Mr. McGough's story differs essentially from one the imagination would paint. He declared that the boat was driving at a high rate of speed at the time of the accident and seemed impressed by the calmness and apathy displayed by the survivors as they tossed on the frozen seas in the little lifeboats until the Carpathia picked them up. The Titanic did not plunge into the water suddenly, he declared, but settled slowly into the deep with its hundreds of passengers. The collision occurred at 20 minutes of 12, said Mr. McGough. I was sleeping in my cabin when I felt a wrench, not severe or terrifying. It seemed to me to be nothing more serious than the racing of the screw, which often occurs when a ship plunges her bow deep into a heavy swell, raising the stern out of the water. We dressed hurriedly and ran to the upper deck. There was little noise or tumult at the time, the promenade decks being higher from the base of the ship and thus more insecure, strained and creaked, so we went to the lower decks. By this time the engines had been reversed, and I could feel the ship backing off. Officers and stewards ran through the corridors, shouting for all to be calm, that there was no danger. We were warned, however, to dress and put life preservers on us. I had on what clothing I could find, and had stuffed some money in my pocket. Parting of Astor and Bride. As I passed the gymnasium, I saw Colonel Astor and his young wife together. She was clinging to him, piteously pleading that he get into the lifeboat with her. He refused almost gruffly, and was attempting to calm her by saying that all her fears were groundless, that the accident she feared would prove a farce. It proved different, however. None, I believe, knew that the ship was about to sink. I did not realize it just then. When I reached the upper deck and saw tons of ice piled upon our crushed bow, the full realization came to me. Officers stood with guns drawn, ordering the women into the boats. All feared to leave the comparative safety of a broad and firm deck for the precarious smaller boats. Women clung to their husbands, crying that they would never leave without them, and had to be torn away. On one point, all the women were firm. They would not enter a lifeboat until men were in it first. They feared to trust themselves to the seas in them. It required courage to step into the frail crafts as they swung from the creaking davits. Few men were willing to take the chance. An officer rushed behind me and shouted, "You are big enough to pull an oar. Jump into this boat or we'll never be able to get the women off." I was forced to do so, though I admit that the ship looked a great deal safer to me than any small boat. Our boat was the second off. 40 or more persons were crowded into it, and with myself and members of the crew at the oars, we were pulled slowly away. Huge icebergs, larger than the Pennsylvania depot at New York, surrounded us. As we pulled away, we could see boat after boat filled and lowered to the waves. Despite the fact that they were new and supposedly in excellent working order, the blocks jammed in many instances, tilting the boats, loaded with people, at varying angles before they reached the water. Band continued playing. As the lifeboats pulled away, the officers ordered the bands to play, and their music did much to quell panic. It was a heartbreaking sight to us tossing in an eggshell 3/4 of a mile away to see the great ship go down. First she listed to the starboard, on which side the collision had occurred. Then she settled slowly but steadily, without hope of remaining afloat. The Titanic was all aglow with lights, as if for a function. First we saw the lights of the lower deck snuffed out. A while later, and the second deck illumination was extinguished in a similar manner. Then the third and upper decks were darkened, and without plunging or rocking, the great ship disappeared slowly from the surface of the sea. People were crowded on each deck as it lowered into the water, hoping in vain that aid would come in time. Some of the lifeboats, caught in the merciless suction, were swallowed with her. The sea was calm, calm as the water in a tumbler, but it was freezing cold. None had dressed heavily, and all, therefore, suffered intensely. The women did not shriek or grow hysterical while we waited through the awful night for help. We men stood at the oars. stood because there was no room for us to sit, and kept the boat headed into the swell to prevent her capsizing. Another boat was at our side, but all the others were scattered around the water. Finally, shortly before 6 o'clock, we saw the lights of the Carpathia approaching. Gradually, she picked up the survivors in the other boats and then approached us. When we were lifted to the deck, the women fell helpless. They were carried to whatever quarters offered themselves, while the men were assigned to the smoking room. Of the misery and suffering which was witnessed on the rescue ship, I know nothing. With the other men survivors, I was glad to remain in the smoking room until New York was reached, trying to forget the awful experience. To us aboard the Carpathia came rumors of misstatements which were being made to the public. The details of the wreck were woefully misunderstood. Let me emphasize that the night was not foggy or cloudy. There was just the beginning of the new moon, but every star in the sky was shining brightly, unmarred by clouds. The boats were lowered from both sides of the Titanic in time to escape, but there was not enough for all. Chapter 17. Wireless Operator Praises Heroic Work. Story of Harold Bride, the surviving wireless operator of the Titanic, who was washed overboard and rescued by lifeboat. Band played Ragtime and Autumn. One of the most connected and detailed accounts of the horrible disaster was that told by Harold Bride, the wireless operator. Mr. Bride said, "I was standing by Phillips, the chief operator, telling him to go to bed, when the captain put his head in the cabin. 'We've struck an iceberg,' the captain said, 'and I'm having an inspection made to tell what it has done for us. You better get ready to send out a call for assistance, but don't send it until I tell you.' The captain went away, and in 10 minutes, I should estimate the time, he came back. We could hear a terrific confusion outside, but there was not the least thing to indicate that there was any trouble. The wireless was working perfectly. 'Send the call for assistance,' ordered the captain, barely putting his head in the door. 'What call shall I send?' Phillips asked. 'The regulation international call for help. Just that.' Then the captain was gone. Phillips began to send CQD. He flashed away at it, and we joked while he did so. All of us made light of the disaster. The Carpathia answered our signal. We told her our position and said we were sinking by the head. The operator went to tell the captain, and in 5 minutes returned and told us that the captain of the Carpathia was putting about and heading for us. Great scramble on deck. Our captain had left us at this time, and Phillips told me to run and tell him what the Carpathia had answered. I did so, and I went through an awful mass of people to his cabin. The decks were full of scrambling men and women. I saw no fighting, but I heard tell of it. I came back and heard Phillips giving the Carpathia fuller directions. Phillips told me to put on my clothes. Until that moment, I forgot that I was not dressed. I went to my cabin and dressed. I brought an overcoat to Phillips. It was very cold. I slipped the overcoat upon him while he worked. Every few minutes, Phillips would send me to the captain with little messages. They were merely telling how the Carpathia was coming our way, and gave her speed. I noticed, as I came back from one trip, that they were putting off women and children in lifeboats. I noticed that the list forward was increasing. Phillips told me the wireless was growing weaker. The captain came and told us our engine rooms were taking water, and that the dynamos might not last much longer. We sent that word to the Carpathia. I went out on deck and looked around. The water was pretty close up to the boat deck. There was a great scramble aft, and how poor Phillips worked through it right to the end, I don't know. He was a brave man. I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt for him a great reverence to see him standing there, sticking to his work, while everybody else was raging about. I will never live to forget the work of Phillips for that last awful 15 minutes. I thought it was about time to look about and see if there was anything detached that would float. I remembered that every member of the crew had a special life belt and ought to know where it was. I remembered mine was under my bunk. I went and got it. Then I thought how cold the water was. I remembered I had an extra jacket and a pair of boots, and I put them on. I saw Philip standing out there still sending away, giving the Carpathia details of just how we were doing. We picked up the Olympic and told her we were sinking by the head and were about all down. As Phillips was sending the message, I strapped his life belt on his back. I had already put on his overcoat. Every minute was precious, so I helped him out all I could. Band plays in ragtime. From aft came the tunes of the band. It was a ragtime tune, I don't know what. Then there was Autumn. Phillips ran aft, and that was the last I ever saw of him. I went to the place where I had seen a collapsible boat on the boat deck, and to my surprise I saw the boat and the men still trying to push it off. I guess there wasn't a sailor in the crowd. They couldn't do it. I went up to them and was just lending a hand when a large wave came awash of the deck. The big wave carried the boat off. I had hold of a rowlock, and I went off with it. The next thing I knew, I was in the boat. But that was not all. I was in the boat, and the boat was upside down, and I was under it. And I remember realizing I was wet through, and that whatever happened, I must not breathe, for I was under water. I knew I had to fight for it, and I did. How I got out from under that boat, I do not know, but I felt a breath of air at last. There were men all around me, hundreds of them. The sea was dotted with them, all depending on their life belts. I felt I simply had to get away from the ship. She was a beautiful sight then. Smoke and sparks were rushing out of her funnel, and there must have been an explosion, but we had heard none. We only saw the big stream of sparks. The ship was gradually turning on her nose, just like a duck does that goes down for a dive. I had one thing on my mind, to get away from the suction. The band was still playing, and I guess they all went down. They were playing Autumn then. I swam with all my might. I suppose I was 150 feet away when the Titanic, on her nose, with her after quarter sticking straight up in the air, began to settle slowly. When at last the waves washed over her rudder, there wasn't the least bit of suction I could feel. She must have kept going just as slowly as she had been. I forgot to mention that, besides the Olympic and the Carpathia, we spoke to some German boat, I don't know which, and told them how we were. We also spoke to the Baltic. I remembered those things as I began to figure what ships would be coming toward us. I felt, after a little while, like sinking. I was very cold. I saw a boat of some kind near me, and put all my strength into an effort to swim to it. It was hard work. I was all done when a hand reached out from the boat and pulled me aboard. It was our same collapsible. There was just room for me to roll on the edge. I lay there, not caring what happened. Somebody sat on my legs. They were wedged in between slats and were being wrenched. I had not the heart left to ask the man to move. It was a terrible sight all around. Men swimming and sinking. I lay where I was, letting the man wrench my feet out of shape. Others came near. Nobody gave them a hand. The bottom-up boat already had more men than it would hold, and it was sinking. At first, the larger waves splashed over my head, and I had to breathe when I could. Some splendid people saved us. They had a right-side-up boat, and it was full to its capacity. Yet they came to us and loaded us all into it. I saw some lights off in the distance and knew a steamship was coming to our aid. I didn't care what happened. I just lay and gasped when I could and felt the pain in my feet. At last the Carpathia was alongside, and the people were being taken up by a rope ladder. Our boat drew near, and one by one the men were taken off of it. The way the band kept playing was a noble thing. I heard it first while we were working wireless, when there was a ragtime tune for us, and the last I saw of the band When I was floating out in the sea with my life belt on, it was still on deck playing Autumn. How they ever did it, I cannot imagine. That, and the way Phillips kept sending after the captain told him his life was his own and to look out for himself, are two things that stand out in my mind over all the rest. Chapter 18. The Story of the Steward. Passengers and crew dying when taken aboard the Carpathia. One woman saved a dog. English colonel swam for hours when boat with mother capsized. Some of the most thrilling incidents connected with the rescue of the Titanic survivors are told in the following account given by a man trained to the sea, a steward of the rescue ship Carpathia. At midnight on Sunday, April 14th, I was promenading the deck of the steamer Carpathia bound for the Mediterranean and 3 days out from New York when an urgent summons came to my room from the chief steward, E. Harry Hughes. I then learned that the White Star liner Titanic, the greatest ship afloat, had struck an iceberg and was in serious difficulties. We were then already steaming at our greatest power to the scene of the disaster, Captain Rostron having immediately given orders that every man of the crew should stand by to exert his utmost efforts. Within a very few minutes, every preparation had been made to receive 2,000 or 3,000 persons. Blankets were placed ready, tables laid with hot soups and coffee, bedding, etc., prepared, and hospital supplies laid out ready to attend to any injured. The men were then mustered in the saloon and addressed by the chief steward. He told them of the disaster and appealed to them in few words to show the world what stuff Britishers were made of, and to add a glorious page to the history of the empire. And right well did the men respond to the appeal. Every lifeboat was manned and ready to be launched at a moment's notice. Nothing further could be done but anxiously wait and look out for the ship's distress signal. Our Marconi operator, whose unceasing efforts for many hours deserved the greatest possible praise, was unable at this time to get any reply to the urgent inquiries he was sending out, and he feared the worst. At last, a blue flare was observed, to which we replied with a rocket. Day was just dawning when we observed a boat in the distance. Iceberg and first boat sighted. Eastward on the horizon, a huge iceberg, the cause of the disaster, majestically reared 2 noble peaks to heaven. Rope ladders were already lowered, and we hove to near the lifeboat, which was now approaching us as rapidly as the nearly exhausted efforts of the men at the oars could bring her. Under the command of our chief officer, who worked indefatigably at the noble work of rescue, the survivors in the boat were rapidly but carefully hauled aboard and given into the hands of the medical staff under the organization of Dr. McGee. We then learned the terrible news that the gigantic vessel, the unsinkable Titanic, had gone down 1 hour and 10 minutes after striking. From this time onward, lifeboats continued to arrive at frequent intervals. Every man of the Carpathia's crew was unsparing in his efforts to assist, to tenderly comfort each and every survivor. In all, 16 boatloads were received, containing altogether 720 persons, many in simply their night attire, others in evening dress, as if direct from an after-dinner reception or concert. Most conspicuous was the coolness and self-possession, particularly of the women. Pathetic and heartrending incidents were many. There was not a man of the rescue party who was not moved almost to tears. Women arrived and frantically rushed from one gangway to another, eagerly scanning the fresh arrivals in the boats for a lost husband or brother. A capsized boat. One boat arrived with the unconscious body of an English colonel. He had been taking out his mother on a visit to 3 others of her sons. He had succeeded in getting her away in one of the boats, and he himself had found a place in another, when but a few yards from the ill-fated ship, the boat containing his mother capsized before his eyes. Immediately he dived into the water and commenced a frantic search for her, but in vain. Boat after boat endeavored to take him aboard, but he refused to give up, continuing to swim for nearly 3 hours until even his great strength of body and mind gave out and he was hauled unconscious into a passing boat and brought aboard the Carpathia. The doctor gives little hope of his recovery. There were, I understand, 12 newly married couples aboard the big ship. The 12 brides have been saved, but of the husbands, all but one have perished. That one would not have been here had he not been urged to assist in manning a lifeboat. Think of the self-sacrifice of these 11 heroes who stood on the doomed vessel and parted from their brides forever, knowing full well that a few brief minutes would end all things for themselves. Many similar pathetic incidents could be related. Sad-eyed women roam aimlessly about the ship, still looking vainly for husbands, brothers, or fathers. To comfort them is impossible. All human efforts are being exerted on their behalf. Their material needs are satisfied in every way. But who can cure a broken heart? Saved her Pomeranian. One of the earliest boats to arrive was seen to contain a woman tenderly clasping a pet Pomeranian. When assisted to the rope ladder, and while the rope was being fastened around her, she emphatically refused to give up for a second the dog which was evidently so much to her. He is now receiving as careful and tender attention as his mistress. A survivor informs me that there was on the ship a lady who was taking out a huge Great Dane dog. When the boats were rapidly filling, she appeared on deck with her canine companion and sadly entreated that he should be taken off with her. It was impossible. Human lives, those of women and children, were the first consideration. She was urged to seize the opportunity to save her own life and leave the dog. She refused to desert him and, I understand, sacrificed her life with him. One elderly lady was bewailing to a steward that she had lost everything. He indignantly replied that she should thank God her life was spared, never mind her replaceable property. The reply was pathetic. "I have lost everything, my husband," and she broke into uncontrollable grief. 4 boats adrift, he says. One incident that impressed me perhaps more than any other was the burial on Tuesday afternoon of 4 of the poor fellows who succeeded in safely getting away from the doomed vessel, only to perish later from exhaustion and exposure as a result of their gallant efforts to bring to safety the passengers placed in their charge in the lifeboats. They were W. H. Hoyt, first-class passenger; Abraham Horner, third-class passenger; S. C. Seibert, steward; P. Lyons, sailor. The sailor and the steward were, unfortunately, dead when taken aboard. The passengers lived but a few minutes after. They were treated with the greatest attention. The funeral service was conducted amid profound silence and attended by large numbers of survivors and rescuers. The bodies, covered by the national flag, were reverently consigned to the mighty deep from which they had been, alas, vainly saved. Most gratifying to the officers and men of the Carpathia is the constantly expressive appreciation of the survivors. He then told of the meeting of the survivors in the cabin of the Carpathia, and of the resolution adopted, a statement of which has already been given in another chapter.